Some of you here know that this isn't the first time I've had to occupy this pulpit in Buddy Stallings' place. But man, to do so in the context of this grand old Calvary Lenten preaching tradition, it kind of even ups the intimidation factor even more. It kind of feels like a scary dream in which I have to pinch hit for Hank Aaron and the coach has just handed me a wiffle bat. I can only imagine what it feels like for you. Anyway, thank you for disguising your crestfallenness when you came in the room today. I'm going to read our scripture for today. I should say I'm going to read it from an actual Bible because on Sunday when I walked up here to put my sermon in the pulpit, I found a Bible lying right here, and I thought, what's that doing here? And I realized that the last preacher was Sam Tidal on Friday, and Sam's a Unitarian. So I got to up the liturgical game just a bit. So it's an actual Bible with actual Bible verses read. This is a reading from the Gospel of Luke, the 12th chapter, beginning in the 13th verse. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who has set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops?" Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God.'" The word of the Lord. Well, I don't know who your favorite pirate is, but mine is a guy named Benjamin Franklin. Maybe you've heard of him. Now, I realize that wearing knickers and a funny hat does not make Mr. Franklin a pirate. He wore no eye patch. He had neither wooden leg nor shoulder parrot. Nowhere in his autobiography or the transcripts of the Constitutional Convention does the word "arg" appear. But Lewis Hyde calls him our founding pirate. And he calls him that with affection, even reverence. Ben Franklin, you see, was an unapologetic pirate of ideas, a thief of intellectual property, as we've come to call it today. As you know, most of the pirates we worry about nowadays are nothing like those swashbuckling sailors of your young imaginations. They're more likely to look like that pimply teenager who's just burned an unauthorized copy of the latest Guardians of the Galaxy movie, in spite of that stern FBI warning that we are magically unable to fast forward through. In a very real sense, Benjamin Franklin was that kind of pirate. I can't confirm the pimples. When he was a younger man, Ben Franklin broke his contract as a printer's apprentice for his brother and headed off to Philadelphia to set up his own shop. This was scandalous because he headed to Philly with a head full of trade secrets, secrets that apprenticeship contracts and the whole guild system were set up to protect from the competition. But Ben Franklin, you see, did not believe in intellectual property. He believed that ideas are meant for the common good, not for private possession. Once they're spoken into the world, he didn't think you should have the right to your own ideas because they're not really yours, or they're barely yours. The little bit that even the most brilliant person among us adds to the world's store of knowledge depends upon everything that's been passed down freely from other generations and from other minds. As another thinker would wonder a couple of hundred years later, if I own a can of tomato juice and spill it into the sea, do I thereby come to own the sea? That's essentially how Ben Franklin understood the source and ownership of his own ideas. And remember, he had a few good ones over the course of his life, didn't he? He discovered things like the polarity of electrical charges. He and some friends also built the first battery in the modern sense of the word. The wood stove he invented changed the way people heated their homes. On his several trips back and forth across the Atlantic, he performed experiments that laid the groundwork for understanding the Gulf Stream. He made dozens of innovations in typesetting. It's astonishing what this man's mind was capable of. But what may be more astonishing to us is that he refused to patent a single thing he ever invented. In fact, he didn't even like to defend his own ideas. That's how committed he was to the free flow of information. He once wrote, "I have never entered into any controversy in defense of my philosophical opinions. I leave them to take their chance in the world. If they are right, truth and experience will support them. If wrong, they ought to be refuted and rejected. Disputes are apt to sour one's temper and disturb one's quiet." Kind of wild, isn't it? Ben Franklin wasn't exactly a hemp-clad hippie from Berkeley, but he was deeply concerned about a kind of greed. Greediness about information and ideas, even about invention itself. He thought it was wrong to pretend that our inventions are purely our own. But he also believed that greedily protecting our ideas and our ingenuity was damaging to the soul, souring its temper, disturbing its quiet. Who knew our quirky old kite-flying forefather might be a helpful guide as we investigate the parable about the rich man and his many, many barns. We should say at the outset that greed is a hard thing to talk about in a helpful way, isn't it? Because it's easy to move this discussion straight out to the extravagant lives of the much richer and the much more famous, people it feels very good to despise. Or else we move it into this unhelpful shame about the fact that, we really, really still want a new iPhone X or that pair of Gucci loafers or, say, a Shinola Runwell bicycle with a handmade Waterford steel frame and a riveted leather saddle, just as an example. We either pretend that greed is reserved for the elites, or we let it stir up this kind of low-level anxious shame that we Christians seem to feel obliged to carry around. We feel a little better by feeling kind of bad, but we don't really do much about it because we never get around to talking about the corner of the soul that might actually be damaged or diminished by the presence of greed in our lives. But don't you think that this soul damage is what Jesus must have been trying to get us to consider when he refused to settle a man's inheritance dispute? Let's take another look. To begin with, we can't slip out of this parable's grasp by assuming it was about someone who was uber rich or dishonest. All we get from the text is that this guy wanted his fair share of his inheritance, right? I mean, come on. Surely he wouldn't have come to Jesus if he had been looking for a shady estate lawyer to help him wrest the family fortune away from his brother. And to our way of thinking, nothing can be more straightforwardly fair than for parents to hand off what they own to their children after they die. But Jesus seems to suggest that greed can be a problem when we're just asking for what's rightfully ours according to the law. Because Jesus says greed is essentially a storage problem. Greed is about trying to store up things the soul needs to let go of in order to be free. It's about finding insecurity in things that can't provide it. Things that do nothing more than distract us from our deeper insecurities, perhaps. Greed is that illusion that I can be secure all by myself as long as my barn or my 401k or my stock portfolio is full, large, and protected. And that is a dangerous, dangerous lie. Because it tells me that security comes from protecting what's mine. And Jesus says real security comes only from giving myself away. How can that be? Well, let's go back to the long-haired guy in funny clothes on the $100 bill. Ben Franklin believed it would diminish our souls if we even treated our ideas as possessions to be defended and protected from would-be thieves. We're diminished because in protecting our ideas, we cut ourselves off from each other. We cut ourselves off from life together and from the astonishing freedom, the real, meaningful freedom that comes only from interaction among people who don't need credit or reward or anything else except the community we've become through that exchange. The community that emerges when we are free to give the best of ourselves and our ideas away. In other words, when we solve our storage problem, we gain one another. Well, in the parable of the rich man and his barns, I really don't think Jesus is giving us one more hard thing to do in order to be saved. It's quite the opposite. Grace is all around us. We just can't see it while we're building our barns and trying to secure a future for ourselves. He's not trying to get us to become good enough or generous enough for God to deem us worthy. He's just trying to get us to look up and realize that God is trying to give us the very people we're so busy protecting our stuff from. They are gifts, not competitors and enemies. Gifts. This is such a transformational truth to me that I want us to come at it from an entirely different angle and see if we can catch another glimpse of this freedom Jesus was trying to give us. And I'll freely admit that I wouldn't have thought to go here were it not for a YouTube video I stumbled on once upon a time. I'm pretty sure it was in the public domain, but I can't confirm that. I mentioned that it's easy to get a well-intentioned Christian to feel a little shame over his greedy impulses. Well, did it ever occur to you that shame and greed might actually share something? As opposite as they seem to be, after all, we might say that the problem with the greedy person is that he has no shame. As opposite as they seem, greed and shame might diminish the soul in very similar ways. In fact, they both might be storage problems. A social worker and researcher named Brene Brown has studied shame intensively for years. Maybe you've heard of her. She's gotten to be a bit of a rock star in shame circles, if there's such a thing. But her studies on shame led her to focus on vulnerability, because shame is what shuts down vulnerability in a person. And by vulnerability, she doesn't mean spilling your guts to the person who sits down beside you on the bus or at coffee hour. She just means letting one's true self out in appropriate ways so we can make a genuine connection with another human being. At the end of the day, it's what we're made for, isn't it? And Brene Brown's research revealed a striking distinction. Shame and guilt are not the same thing, not at all. Guilt says, I've made a mistake, I'm sorry. Shame says, I am a mistake. I've made a mistake, I'm sorry, gives me a way forward. I am a mistake pushes me to build barns and walls around the self I don't think this world really wants to see. And all the research says that shame is powerfully correlated with addictions and eating disorders and all kinds of destructive behaviors in our lives. With simple guilt, the correlation is inverse. Realizing not that I'm a mistake, but that I've made one, as all humans do, gives me the freedom to choose differently. It provides the space to make decisions that are more life-giving, because I don't have to hide who I am from you, even if you're the one who I've just wronged. Maybe especially if you're the one I've just wronged. So Jesus' teaching on greed isn't meant to push us into shame. Shame and greed both cause us to hold on to things too tightly. They close off our souls and they shut us down. We protect and store up and keep ourselves safe from people who want to take away our things or discover the truth about our wounded souls. And so it really is in trying to keep our lives safe that we lose them. Because those people we're protecting ourselves, our inheritances, our inventions from, are the very people God has sent to make us whole. They may be the strange other members of the body of Christ, necessary to us because of their difference, not in spite of it. I guess we'll never know what came of the man who walked up to Jesus for help with that inheritance dispute. He couldn't have known that in the end, the prophet he'd come to for advice would refuse to defend even his own life, that he died the death of a criminal, hung up on a cross as an example. He couldn't have known how utterly ungreedily he would spend himself, and that everything, even our stores of guilt and shame, would somehow be changed in his doing so. And he certainly couldn't have known that 2,000 years later, you and I would be here at Calvary listening to a story about a rich man and his silly barns, and that it could still sound like breaking news for our lives all these years later. He couldn't have known all of that, but he must have felt some of that. In fact, he might have walked away from the prophet's strange parable, not shamed, but lightened a little, freed. His world suddenly a little less ominous, his wealth maybe a little less endangered, his soul a little healed. And maybe, just maybe, he left Jesus that day and took another way home, stopping at that nondescript house along the way. Maybe he knocked a little nervously, but a little hopefully at the door. And maybe when his long-estranged brother answered, he finally saw him, finally received him, finally embraced him as the gift from God he'd forgotten he was. Maybe, because there may be no limit to what even one short encounter with this Jesus can restore. Amen.